US Chapter 17, Section 3, Mass Culture and Family Life. How did popular culture and family life change in the 50s? So we'll look at consumer spending. We'll look at some of the changes in family life in terms of how kids are raised and just things that are different in the 50s than they were before. And then new forms of mass culture, especially when we get to music such as rock and roll. So when we look at this culture of consumerism, and what consumerism is buying stuff, things. There's a few factors. Spending becomes much easier. One, because income is increasing. So the average family income is increasing, which is a good thing. But the real number that is significant is real income. So what real income is, once you adjust for inflation and all those types of things, how much money do you actually have? So when you start talking about real income nearly doubling, that's the amount of money that Americans have in their pockets to spend. And this is compared to the prosperous years of the 1920s. So when things were booming in the 1920s and people went out to buy things, when you look at the 1950s, Americans could afford to buy twice as many goods because they have that much extra money. Now, the other factor is credit that was started in the 1920s. Because the economy is booming, because Americans have more money, because there's more products to buy, the requirements for credit get loosened. And so that means more Americans can borrow more money to make bigger purchases. And that's really what we're going to see happening through the 1950s. So what are the things that they're purchasing? One is home appliances, especially things like refrigerators. But you also have automatic washing machines and dryers. All those types of things are going to make life simpler, easier. The other thing it's going to do is it's going to free up a lot of time for moms around America. And the reason I say moms around America is because at that time, the division of household labor is pretty clear cut and defined. The man is supposed to make the money. The wife is supposed to take care of the home. And so when you have these modern appliances, it's going to make life a whole heck of a lot easier. The other thing that you're going to see is because of easy credit, because of having money, because of pent-up demand, Americans went without during the Great Depression, went without during World War II. They're ready to buy, and there's plenty of stuff to buy. So shopping is going to kind of become a bit of a new pastime. People are going to go do it for fun. I don't necessarily understand that, but some people do. And the other thing that a lot of Americans are buying are televisions. Those are just getting out on the market. The places where electricity is available has increased dramatically through the New Deal. And that's really going to pick up steam post-World War II. And now more and more Americans can not only afford to have a TV, but have the electricity to be able to have it. And TV is really going to shape the view of family life. This idea of a nuclear family as the backbone of society, a mom, a dad, 4.6 kids, whatever the average of it was. But now all of a sudden, instead of gathering around the radio, Americans are going to gather around the TV, and they're going to see all kinds of things in terms of historical events, presidential addresses, presidential campaigns, sporting events. It's really going to change America in a lot of ways. And so when we look at the role of media, magazines, newspapers, as well as television, it's really shaping this view of what family life should be like, what mom should do, what dad should do. And when you look at these sitcoms that are on TV, these 30-minute TV shows where the family runs into some kind of trouble and in the matter of 30 minutes is able to resolve that problem, it really kind of gives Americans this overly idyllic version of what family life should be like. With the baby boom, we're going to see the focus of Americans shifting from things that it once was on to where children are kind of the focus. Dr. Benjamin Spock writes this famous book, Baby and Child Care. It's really the first time in the history of the United States where and I don't know exactly if that's true or not, but it's really the first time in the United States where Americans in huge numbers are going out and they're buying this book and they're reading this book and they're trying to learn how to become better parents. And so he advocates for nurturing children. Um, he believes that you can't really spoil kids, that you should, basically give them what they want. And then the question becomes, did Dr. Benjamin Spock create a situation where we have overindulged our kids, that we haven't said no enough, that we haven't given them enough hard lessons in life, and that's unknowable, I guess. When we look at what's happening in terms of family life with religion, what we're going to see is church attendance is going to go up fairly dramatically. More and more Americans are going to church on Sundays. Now, the other thing that you see too is with the threat of communism, the United States is really going to try and portray this fight of good versus evil, that the communist empire is godless, and that we are morally, ethically, culturally, economically, all facets of everything, a better way of life compared to the Soviet Union. And that's where we see Congress putting "In God We Trust" on our money. That didn't exist before the 1950s. And also in the Pledge of Allegiance, the "one nation under God" is put into there. Prior to that, the Pledge of Allegiance didn't have that phrase. When we look also what things are happening is the baby boomers are going to benefit from improved health care, not just through childhood, but because of this improved health care, they're living longer. Their life expectancy is longer than any other generation in the United States. So you've got the polio vaccine, which is going to rid the United States of that scourge, of that terror. And in the 40s and the 50s and the 60s, that was one of the things that kept Americans up at night, is that their kid would contract polio and lose the use of their limbs. The other thing is antibiotics are going to be used, and that's going to help deal with a lot of infections and all those types of things. And what we've kind of run into is now we've kind of overused those antibiotics, and now we're starting to see these drug-resistant strains of fungus most recently. But that's going to be a concern, and we're either going to have to, we're going to have to come up with new forms of fighting those things, because pretty soon antibiotics won't be very effective anymore. But that is the real new kind of threat and fear. So for TV, it is aimed at baby boomers. It's kind of, as baby boomers have aged, TV has gone with it. So as they've moved through the different stages of their lives, then that kind of becomes the focus of television. So in the 1950s and 60s, it was kids programs. And then in the 70s and the 80s, it's going to be these dramas. So it's really kind of interesting. And I've already talked about the sitcoms, how they're reflecting and reinforcing what families should be like. The other thing is TV is going to speed up this mass culture simply because Americans from all over the United States are tuning in and watching these programs, or the Super Bowl or the World Series, and they have more things that they have in common. It also is going to change politics, because when you look at the 1960 presidential election, TV plays a role in JFK winning. It's hard to know exactly how much it impacted things, but that televised debate was the moment that JFK broke away from Richard Nixon. And most Americans point to that. As they watched it, they thought Kennedy was youthful, he was vigorous, he looked more presidential. They thought Nixon looked tired and haggard and worn down and much older than what he really was. And then you talk to the people who listened on the radio, and they felt that Nixon had easily won. So TV is going to now shape politicians, in that you need to look a certain way, and you need to present yourself a certain way on television, and those are going to make impacts. The other thing is rock and roll. So the first time we hear the term rock and roll used is at this Ohio radio station. This jockey, Alan Freed, used the term. And so now, after that point, that term is going to stick and it's going to spread. Just a few years ago, one of the fathers of rock and roll was Chuck Berry. He died March 18th, 2017. So we're starting to lose some of these. But there is an awful lot of African American roots in this. You got Muddy Waters on the left there. You got Chuck Berry on the right. And these musicians are going to shape the future generation. So when you start talking about not only Elvis Presley, but the Beatles, the Rolling Stones, Led Zeppelin, the list goes on of these rock bands who point to these African American musicians that inspired them and that they're modeling their music after. They're going to be the movers and the shakers of rock and roll. Now, what makes rock and roll go big time is when Elvis Presley, who is a white musician, shows up on the Ed Sullivan Show, and all of a sudden, rock and roll music is really going to explode, and more Americans are going to be tuning into it.